Now, to answer these questions, first of all, who are the participants? And it's people of all walks of life, essentially, in Korea. They're, of course, Korean people, but they're also people who are, there's old, there's young, there's men and women. And I wanted to include that to emphasize that nationalism is something that focuses on all the people of the nation. I also want to emphasize that this is expected to be their primary loyalty. The focus was on them being Korean, and naturally they're going to be cheering for the Koreans at the Olympics. They're not going to go to the Olympics with signs that say, "Go Baptists," or "Go Catholics," or "Go Muslims," or "Go members of the Democratic Party," or members of the Republican Party, or anything like that. They're going to be there cheering other Koreans. And I do want to point out also where this takes place. I find it fascinating because it takes place in a palace. This was actually the old palace where the king of Korea would rule. And he's missing. He's not there. And that's because the people are the king. And in fact, they all go up and they're standing where the king would stand. And I find it fascinating that in that area where they formed the Korean flag with their bodies, that was the area where the king's officials would meet and assemble to serve the king. And you may notice all those little stone posts. Those were meant to show what line you should sit in depending on your rank. So it was very hierarchically ordered. There was a king at the top and all these officials, and the distance they were from the king was based on their rank. So if you had a high rank, you were close to the king. If you had a low rank, you were farther from the king. But nationalism, those officials and those that king is not so important. What's important is the people. And that's why one thing I thought was really fascinating was they kept on saying 50, that it was interesting they kept saying 50 million. That's only the population of South Korea. I thought it was interesting that they didn't also include North Korea. I guess it's because they're competing against North Korea, but according to nationalism, North Korea and South Korea should actually be united. So the idea I was trying to emphasize here is this idea of nationalism. In nationalism, and it's somewhat similar to liberalism, there's this idea that sovereignty comes from the nation, and the nation is a group of people, and an identifiable group of people. And each one of these nations should have its own state. So there's a Japanese people, they should have a Japanese state. There's a Korean people, they should have a Korean state. There's German people, they should have a German state, and so forth. And there should only be one state for each nation. So the fact that there's two Korean states, even though there's only one Korean nation, that's a problem. And that's why Korean people would like to eventually reunite. Now, what's also understood in nationalism is that the nation state is supposed to be your primary loyalty of the people, right? Your main loyalty is supposed to be to your nation, to your country, not to your family, not to your religion, not to anything like that. That's supposed to be your main loyalty. And of course, that's kind of a tension there. And that's one thing I just want to point out. That's why I include this image. You can see these cute little Filipino children. You know they're Filipino because they're holding a Filipino flag, riding a carabao, which is a water buffalo. And I think it's interesting. They usually you would traditionally just have a boy and a girl to show these kind of nationalist images to represent that both men and women are parts of the nation. But you'll notice they have that boy on the far right, and you can tell by his clothing that he's identified as a Muslim boy. The Philippines is a predominantly Christian country, but the island group around Mindanao, the southern part of the Philippines, has a large number of Muslims. And sometimes there's been difficulties integrating them into the state. And this is trying to emphasize here, no, even though we have different religions, we're still all Filipinos, and we should unite around that idea. Now, one thing you'll notice in that music video I just played for you, with Psy in it, that the Korean people are active, right? They're up, they're jumping, they're shouting, they're saying how great their country is, they're cheering on their people. And this is because nationalism doesn't expect people to simply be passive subjects. Remember, King Louis XIV just kind of expected people to be quiet and pay their taxes. Nationalism doesn't want you to just do that. In nationalism, you're supposed to be an active citizen. You're supposed to be actively going out and supporting your country and supporting your government. And that, for example, by coming out and voting. And this is supposed to be active. You're supposed to be actively out there serving your country. To give an example, during World War I in Germany, German people would actually donate gold to their government, and then the government would give them, and they would send in their wedding rings. They would give their government their wedding rings to help fight the war. In return, the government would give them a ring made of iron back to symbolize their sacrifice. And in Korea in the 1990s, when they went through an economic crisis, people were doing the same thing. They were donating their jewelry to the government. That's active citizenship. Now, liberals were also often nationalists. They would look to the powerful nation state, the single state with a single nation, as the protector of liberty. And what's really important about this, in particular, is you remember we talked about the very beginning of class of this great divide between elite and commoners, and how it was difficult to overcome this great divide. Well, through nationalism, as we'll see going forward, because it's such a simple idea, we are the people of the nation, we should work together and to support our nation state. And we have identity as members of this nation. This is going to be such a simple but powerful idea. It will be able to cross the Great Divide. And we'll talk a little bit more shortly about how that happens. And in fact, it's going to increasingly replace religion as people's most important identifier. People are going to think of themselves more in terms of their America, to their national identity than other things. And this is important, right? Or you can see this today. It's not really polite to ask someone what religion they are. And I would get in a lot of trouble, especially since we're a public university, if I was to ask you that question. But on the other hand, there's no problem with me asking what country you come from. That's fine, because that's kind of considered a public important thing, whereas religion, well, that's kind of private. It's not so important. Now, what's important about this also is that this is connected to an idea of what we call an imagined community. Most people, through most parts of history, did not live in communities or lived in communities that were face-to-face communities. You lived in the village or a small town where everyone knew everyone. And a lot of you that are from South Carolina maybe grew up in such a town. And in that sense, there was a real sense of community. Here at Lander, because we're a small university, we have a very strong sense of community. It's not uncommon for me to have the same students several times in my in my teaching. So we really get to know each other. And that's just kind of a face-to-face traditional community. When you have this idea of nationalism, though, you're moving to a community where most people don't see each other, right? You don't, for example, I've never been to North Dakota, but I still think of people from North Dakota as part of my community, part of the American national community. And so that's why we call it an imagined community, not because it's not real, but because it's something that happens in our minds, in our imaginations. It's not something, like I said, I've never been there, but I think of that as part of our country. Now, one thing I also want to emphasize is that there's different kinds of nationalism. The nationalism that was especially popular in 19th century Europe was what we call ethnic nationalism. And it was based around ethnic identity, particularly the language that you spoke really formed it. And there's this kind of ethnic linguistic nationalism. And you see this in Korea, for example. What is the Korean nation? Well, it's people who are Korean, people who are members of a certain ethnic group. That's different from civic nationalism. And the United States has civic nationalism. In civic nationalism, your nation is identified by your loyalty to the law, basically, your loyalty to the Constitution. So, for example, my wife was originally a Filipino citizen. She became an American citizen, and that wasn't a problem. People accept her as an American citizen because we don't have ethnic nationalism. It's fine. She can say, hey, I'm an American. People are like, okay, that's right. But to become that, she had to take an oath of loyalty to the Constitution to defend it. I think, again, what was it? It was to defend it against enemies, both domestic and foreign. So I always had this image of my wife vigorously with some weapon vigorously defending our Constitution. But the idea, though, is that she could become a citizen of the United States, and no one thinks anything about it, or no one would say, well, you can't be a American, you're a Filipino. Right? That we don't say that because our idea of nationalism, of belonging to the nation, is based around adherence to the Constitution and certain values. And anyone who believes in those values can accept that.